Hello, and welcome to the Fairy Tale Magazine's Fairy Tale Voices, a series where we bring you conversations with writers, scholars, poets, and artists who use fairy tale and folklore in their work. I'm Kelly Jarvis, and today I'm joined by Jane Harrington, a fellow at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts who teaches classes in writing and literature at Washington and Lee and Hollins Universities. Jane's experiences as a teacher, parent, and park nationalist have inspired her to pen several works for children and young adults, and her adult novel, Encircling Flight, a tale of resilient friendship set in Appalachia, won the 2019 Brighthorse Prize. Jane's latest work, Women of the Fairy Tale Resistance, the forgotten founding mothers of the fairy tale and the stories that they spun, is of special interest to all of us here at the Fairy Tale Magazine. And we are delighted to have Jane join us to talk about her book today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we're very excited about your book at the Fairy Tale Magazine. Now, Women of the Fairy Tale Resistance seeks to revive the lives and the stories of seven free-thinking women who were salon writers during 17th century France. And they actually coined the term fairy tale and helped to shape the form as we know it. Tell us a little bit about the women that you explore in this book and why you wanted to shed a light on the work that they have done.
I discovered these women only about 8 years ago. I grew up on fairy tales, Disney, fractured fairy tales, picture books. I raised my kids on fairy tales, bringing in some more interesting tales too, like Oscar Wilde's tales, but never ran across any tales by these women. And when I started teaching the fairy tale at WNL, I was struck by something I hadn't much thought about before, that fairy tales were the province of men. And I wanted to find women tellers, not just Beauty and the Beast is, the only one that we think about. Generally well known as by a woman writer, de Beaumont. And so I started digging around and discovered that these women were very famous. They were contemporaries and colleagues of Charles Perrault. They were much more popular than Charles Perrault. They wrote, some 70 some tales that sold like crazy in France. And they, as you said, they coined the term fairy tale. And yet, like I never knew the tales, and I wanted to know more about them and read some of their tales and have my students read some of their tales. So it started this research project that whenever I had a chance, I would try to educate myself more on these women, and found that they were, known. I mean, I heard about them in scholarly circles, like in academic writing. And some of their tales have been translated in, scholarly versions. Um, and so I was able to learn some things about them through like English language scholarship. But then when I started thinking about this in terms of a book, and got a publisher for it, um, I I really only knew about, I could only learn about three of them: D'Aulnoy, LaForce, and Marat. Those were the only ones I ever could find any information on, but I knew there were others. And so my editor at Black Dog and Leventhal asked me to try to find out more about these other women. They were all of them fairly erased from history, and those especially. So I had to then dig into the French resources and try to patch together some information about their lives. It's still very spotty what's available, even when you dig dig very deep. And when I was doing that, I discovered that what I did know or thought I knew about the three women that I did know about, that a lot of the information that had come down through, into scholarship was actually not accurate, or it was incomplete, and that there had been a lot of bias and um, just dismissiveness that had gone with the memories of these women's lives, which is not uncommon for women in history. That's sort of the story, is that very often we just get sort of a dismissive, tainted version that's very biased. And so I had to completely sort of rewrite what I had already written about these women, the three women I had started with. And so the research on this book was really an adventure that I was really glad at the end to learn about them. Their stories are interesting, heartbreaking. Their lives were disrupted, destroyed by just forces of the patriarchy, basically, and it continued, even after their lives were over, sort of this erasure of their work, which, unlike the fairy tales that did endure, Charles Perrault's, the women, the female protagonists in the stories in these women's stories are strong. They're making choices. They have backstories. They are intelligent. They have agency, even if they're fighting against, forces that are trying to keep them from power and happiness. And so it's very different than the tales that endured, or were sort of allowed to endure. They mostly have these female protagonists that are very submissive, very quiet, asleep, comatose. That is like and the reward is this, the prince at the end. So it's very different, the tales that these women produced.
So, this will be a fascinating resource for all people who are interested in studying the real fairy tales that we're being told, and not just the ones that have come down to us. As you do note, even though these tales were so popular at the time that these women were writing, today, when we think of fairy tale tellers, we tend to think of the men, the Brothers Grimm, Charles Perrault, Andrew Lang. Do you have a theory for why this erasure of female voices has happened? And do you think that women artists of the 20th and 21st century have been able to reclaim the fairy tale narrative in the work that they do?
Well, I'd say, it is a symptom of just what the forces that were at play throughout literature, which is that it was um, male dominated, and it's not just the fairy tale. And so the it was men who were the gatekeepers. So all the men were the censors, the men were the publishers, the men were the ones creating the editions of, reissues of the stories. And ultimately the Brothers Grimm ended up being major gatekeepers. They chose to not even credit any of the women for any work. The only story that they included in their collection of fairy tales, um, that is directly from these women, is their Rapunzel, which is an actual translation of Charlotte Rose LaForce's tale, and she's not given any credit. The Grimms were scholars. They had voluminous notes in their 7 editions of the fairy tales that they produced and that they collected and rewrote. So it was intentional. So I think that you can say that there was an intentional um, uh, omission of these women, and they were just dismissed as unruly women. Many of them have, harrowing stories about being exiled because, they said something the king didn't like, or, they, whatever, were behaving. One was, in a lesbian relationship, and she got sent away to a prison because of that. I mean, there's so many things that happened to these women that are in the book, but so even like, so I'd say women finally did sort of reclaim the space. Um, you certainly in the 21st century, when you get the feminist fairy tales, you get all the feminist retellings. But they had started in some, obviously earlier, a little bit, at least in children's stories, if not fairy tales, But it took a while for, the Angela Carter, the Anne Sexton, Margaret Atwood, etc., to say, wait a minute, like these Grimm's tales are terribly sexist. Like, what are we doing? And then writing retellings. And so I'd say that's when it's changed since then.
Yeah, I love that you're doing almost like this archaeological work to bring the female voice back into the fairy tale. I think that that's really fabulous. Now, in addition to reviving the tale tellers in your book, you also retell some of the fairy tales themselves, right? In your beautiful book. You already said that you saw a difference in terms of the characters, particularly the female characters and the way they're presented when they're filtered through a female voice. But did you have a favorite fairy tale retelling that made its way into your book that you can share with us?
Well, yeah, it's hard to pick, but there are 12, I think it's 12, and then one short verse tale that I retold for that book. It was hard to pick which ones to retell. I wanted them all to be the female characters to also be sort of women of the fairy tale resistance. That sort of idea I had in my head about how the 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 tellers themselves, these women, were resisting the patriarchy through these stories in subtle ways, because that's the only way they could do it. But when you read them in light of knowing like what their lives were like, you see, oh, they're pushing against power here. They're pushing against these kinds of marital norms. They're pushing against, whatever, they're the restrictions they had on things like not being able to access their money or be able to travel freely and all these things. And so the characters are so much freer. They are able, they have struggles, but they're able to succeed and become, queens in charge of a queendom, or just have access to some power and freedom. So I just wanted sort of a variety. Um, and I maybe, maybe my favorite is um, is Bell Bell, which is a cross-dressing tale. And a number of these women wrote cross-dressing tales. And the thing is, when you study these women's works, you see the similarities between their works and, say, Charles Perrault's. And it's because they were writing in a salon workshop atmosphere. So like there would be a prompt, writing prompt. And so here's the scenario. Let's all try to write versions of this, whatever that is. And that's why there are similarities. Some scholarship, they want to argue about whether they were plagiarizing. And it's like, no, it's how it was. This is how these were created. And it's the case of, say, Perrault's, I know you all know Diamonds and Toads, that Amy Trent has that version I haven't read yet, but I look forward to it. Or The Fairies. Perrault has that. Well, the women have those stories too. There's a version of that in my book. It's called Blanche. But that is based on Marie Jean Larity's Enchantments of Eloquence, which obviously was part of the same prompt, or else Charles Perrault is the one who who lifted it from her. She was related to him, but chances are it was just part of this salon culture. They created stories, they entertained each other, and then they would write them down and submit them to be published. So there's a lot of overlap. Anyway,
It's
that's not,
fascinating to see.
I don't have a favorite. Yeah.
Don't have a favorite. It's always so hard to pick a favorite, but it's fascinating to see how one prompt can lead to so many different variations in the voices of different people. And that's something that I think people who work with fairy tales are still doing today, kind of using a similar prompt to retell their own stories. So I think that that's actually really cool. Now, I know you teach college classes in children's literature as well. So I'm sure you're aware that fairy tales are oftentimes relegated to the nursery, even though they really were not stories intended for child audiences when they were originally being circulated or originally being written down. Do you think that it diminishes fairy tales to classify it as children's literature? Or do you think that fairy tales is an important part of the children's literature genre that can enrich the lives of those who are studying them?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm a writer. I don't come at my fairy tale interest from a folklore background. My terminal degree is an MFA in fiction. And when I get really interested in something, I go down the rabbit hole and, I just have a great time and I learn about it and I write about it. So I have a lot of things I've written about. But, and I started my writing career writing for children and young adults. I didn't write fairy tales, when I started teaching the fairy tale, I was doing it in a class on children's literature. And so at some point, though, I realized, yes, just what you're saying, fairy tales are a part of children's literature, but they, go well beyond that. They transcend those boundaries, and it's hard to say where they do that and when. And so teaching fairy tales in a class that was a children's literature class was constraining to me. I no longer teach it through that particular course. I teach it as a fairy tale course. So now it's fine. Talking about the children's aspects of it, when Charles Perrault was writing his stories, he envisioned them for children, even though they're bawdy but the women weren't. They were thinking anybody. And then I asked the question, well, what was a child then? At 13, they were being married off and having children. They were, at the same time, they were enjoying a story. They were probably reading it to their kids. So it's like, to me, the category, like the line is so mushy between for fairy tales at least, what is for children and what isn't. But there's definitely these obviously abbreviated versions of all tales that's what picture books are all about, that they are watered down versions, or not in a negative way. They're beautiful, they're meant for younger audiences. And that's a whole subset of the fairy tale genre, definitely.
Yeah. Teaching children's literature was absolutely my gateway to fairy tale as well. And then I found that I was teaching fairy tales in all the other classes that I taught because it really can't be contained by that genre, as fun as it is to discuss it within the boundaries of that genre. So I think it's fascinating that you have had experience with both of those things. Well, I can't let you go without just touching on your adult novel, Encircling Flight, because I really love it. It follows the lives of characters living in Appalachia as they deal with the pain and the trauma of psychological and sociological and environmental fallout. The narrative is rich with natural imagery. There's Celtic folklore. It's about the beauty of storytelling itself. These are all the things that I love in a good book. So I so enjoyed it. Can you speak to the way that stories, and particularly those old stories that align with the turning of the seasons, help the characters in your novel to build their resilience and to resist power, and how even those stories can help your audience, your readers, to build resistance and resilience to power as well.
That's really a great question. That's something for me to think about. But I'd say in general, those stories, and so those go back to Celtic lore, like Irish stories based around the solstice and equinox and how they viewed that, or the cross quarters. And in that story, those characters are trying to survive the famine and or the Great Hunger, more appropriately called. Um, and the stories help, like, to me, they transcend that. Like, it's about something more spiritual. There, many of them aren't going to survive, but stories will. And I'd say, and that also helps the contemporary characters in that book to cope with the loss they're seeing in their lives in the mountains because of mountaintop removal mining. And so it's to me, yeah, story is really the base there. I have a lot of interest in Irish. That's one of the rabbit holes I've spent a lot of time in, is Irish history and Irish lore, the Great Hunger narratives, and also, and hopefully there'll be a book out. I've kind of working on it that focuses on Speranza, Lady Wilde, who is Oscar Wilde's mother. And I have a special interest in Oscar Wilde's fairy tales. I've done a number of retellings. They are available online, so you can go to my website and find some of those. But I've also written about her and studied her. She's another woman who, an important woman activist, and a woman of literature and folklore, poet, and who's basically in the shadows of history. She's just Oscar Wilde's mother. And so she appears in that book. That's the echo, that Speranza, that the poetry that one of the characters is hearing. That's hers. But I have more of I have a better homage to her and sort of that Irish story tradition in another novel I'm working on. So maybe that'll appear. Story's everything.
I love that in both your novels, your fiction, and then also in this book, which is really kind of relaying a little bit about history, you really are tapping into the power of story and how storytelling is a form of resistance. And I think that that is something that's really beautiful and a thread that connects all of your works. You write beautifully, and we thank you for lending your voice to those forgotten voices of the women who were at the forefront of the great fairy tale tradition. So thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your work.
Thank you for having me. This was really nice. And as I was telling you before we got on, I actually have a copy of the book now, and I'm just so happy about this book coming out.
It was golden letters. Oh, just spun like gold. Very fairy tale. It's a beautiful cover and a beautiful book, and we can't wait until everyone has a chance to read it. You can learn more about Jane Harrington by visiting her website, janeharrington.com, and be sure to check out Women of the Fairy Tale Resistance and all of her other books as well. We know that you will not be disappointed. Once again, this has been Fairy Tale Voices. I'm Kelly Jarvis, and for everyone at the Fairy Tale Magazine, thanks for watching.